There is a name most people say once and then forget. They remember the cross. They remember the empty tomb. They remember Mary weeping in the garden and Peter running, and the stone rolled away in the pale light of that first morning. But there is another man who was there, not at the tomb, but at the trial, at the center of everything that led to it. His name was Caiaphas, and after that weekend changed the world forever. Almost no one asks what happened to him. Maybe because we assume we already know. Maybe because villains in the story are supposed to disappear once the hero rises. Maybe because it is easier to leave him frozen in that moment, pointing, accusing, tearing his robes, than to follow him out of the courtroom and into the years that came after. But history did not stop for Caiaphas when the stone rolled away. He woke up on that Sunday morning. He ate. He walked. He gave orders. He continued to be the most powerful religious figure in Jerusalem, at least for a little while longer. And what followed him, what quietly unraveled around him in the years after the resurrection, is something very few people have ever sat down to truly consider. Tonight, we are going to consider it, not to judge him, not to celebrate his downfall, but because his story, the part nobody tells, holds something inside it that speaks directly to something you and I are carrying right now. Stay with me tonight. To understand what happened to Caiaphas after the resurrection, you have to understand who he was before it. Because Caiaphas was not simply a villain in a story, he was a system, he was an institution. He was the carefully constructed result of decades of political maneuvering, religious compromise, and the kind of slow, quiet deal-making that powerful men learn to justify to themselves over time. His full name was Joseph ben Caiaphas. He served as high priest of Jerusalem for roughly 18 years, from around 18 AD to 36 AD. That is an extraordinarily long tenure for that position. Most high priests came and went quickly, at the pleasure of Rome. The fact that Caiaphas lasted so long tells you something important about the kind of man he was. He knew how to survive. He had married into the right family. His father-in-law was Annas, the former high priest, the real power behind the curtain, the man whose shadow fell across every major decision in Jerusalem for a generation. When the Romans removed Annas from the official position, they did not remove his influence. They never could. And Caiaphas, by marrying Annas' daughter, had bound himself permanently to that influence. He was protected, connected, insulated. He understood Rome. He understood what Rome wanted, which was silence, order, no disturbances, no movements that gathered crowds and raised questions about power and kingship and the kingdom of God. Rome wanted the lid kept on. And Caiaphas was very good at keeping the lid on. This is why Jesus troubled him so deeply. It was not purely theological. There were plenty of wandering teachers in Judea. There were debates about the law, arguments about the Sabbath, disagreements about purity. These things were almost ambient noise in Jerusalem. Caiaphas could manage theological argument. What he could not manage was a man who raised the dead. When Lazarus walked out of that tomb in Bethany, something shifted in Caiaphas. John's Gospel records it plainly. The chief priests and Pharisees called an emergency council, and the fear they expressed was not spiritual, it was political. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Our place. That word sits there quietly and says everything. They were not primarily afraid of losing Israel. They were afraid of losing their position within Israel, their temple, their authority, their carefully constructed arrangement with an empire that despised them but tolerated them as long as they kept things quiet. And so Caiaphas stood up in that council and said something that has echoed through theology for 2,000 years. He said it was better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. He meant it as cold political calculation. He had no idea he was speaking prophecy. That is one of the most extraordinary ironies buried in the gospel narratives, that the man who orchestrated the crucifixion became, without knowing it, a vessel for announcing its deepest meaning. He said the words. He did not understand the words. He was standing inside a moment far larger than his own comprehension, and he could not see it. None of us ever fully see the moments we are standing inside. Caiaphas arrested Jesus in the garden. He conducted the night trial, irregular by Jewish law, rushed, held in darkness, driven by urgency. He sent him to Pilate. He pressed the crowd. He got what he wanted, or so he believed. By Friday afternoon, Jesus was dead and in the tomb. The threat, as far as Caiaphas was concerned, had been neutralized. The lid was back on. Rome was satisfied. The Passover crowds would disperse. Jerusalem would return to its rhythms. He went home that Friday evening with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had managed a crisis efficiently. He had no idea what Sunday morning was going to do to everything he thought he had secured. Sunday came, and with it, something that no arrangement with Rome could contain. Something that no council could vote away. Something that no amount of political maneuvering or institutional authority had ever been built to withstand. The tomb was empty. Think about what that morning must have felt like inside the halls of the high priest's house. The reports would have arrived in pieces, the way disturbing news always does. Fragmented, confused, each messenger adding a detail that made the picture stranger and more unsettling than the one before. The guards had fled, the stone had been moved, the body was gone. And then, slowly, something worse than the empty tomb began to spread through Jerusalem. Witnesses. Not one or two frightened women speaking in whispers. Hundreds of people, over the weeks that followed, claiming the same impossible thing. That they had seen him, that he had spoken to them, that he had eaten with them, that the hands still carried the marks of the nails, and yet he stood before them, alive, in a way that was more real and more solid than anything they had words for. Caiaphas had spent his entire career managing narratives. He knew how stories spread. He knew how to suppress a rumor, how to discredit a witness, how to let a movement exhaust itself against the weight of institutional indifference. He had seen messiahs come and go. They always collapsed eventually. Their followers scattered, their names faded, the institution remained. But this was different, and some part of him must have known it. Because the followers of Jesus did not scatter. They gathered. They grew louder, not quieter. They filled the temple courts, his temple courts, and spoke openly about the resurrection. They healed people in the name of the man he had crucified, and the crowds that gathered to watch were not small. The book of Acts records what happened next with a kind of quiet precision that makes it even more powerful. Peter and John were arrested and brought before the council, before Caiaphas himself. And Peter, the same Peter who had stood by a charcoal fire 7 weeks earlier and denied 3 times that he even knew Jesus, now stood in front of the most powerful religious authority in the world and spoke without a tremor in his voice. He told them directly, "You crucified him. God raised him. There is salvation in no one else." Caiaphas sat across from him and felt something that powerful men rarely feel and almost never admit. He had no answer. Luke records it carefully. The council saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, and they were astonished. And they recognized that they had been with Jesus. They recognized it. Even Caiaphas, even the men who had engineered the crucifixion, looked at these fishermen standing before them and saw something they could not explain away and could not argue against and could not manage. So they did what institutions do when they cannot defeat something. They threatened it. They commanded Peter and John to speak no more in the name of Jesus. And Peter looked at them, looked at Caiaphas, and said something so simple and so devastating that it has never lost its edge in 2,000 years. Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot stop speaking of what we have seen and heard. We cannot stop speaking of what we have seen and heard. There is a kind of witness that cannot be managed, that does not respond to threats or counsels or institutional authority, that does not need permission to tell the truth. It simply speaks because it has no other option, because what it has seen is too real and too large and too alive to be contained in silence. Caiaphas released them, not because he wanted to, because the crowd was watching, and the man who had been healed was standing right there, and there was nothing he could say that would make that man's healed legs a matter of debate. He was beginning to lose the one thing he had always been most careful to protect, his grip. And a man like Caiaphas, who had built everything on his ability to hold things together, who had given his whole life to maintaining a careful balance of power, when that man begins to feel his grip loosening, something happens inside him that goes beyond politics. It reaches down into the deepest question any of us ever face. What do I do when the thing I built my life on is no longer holding? That question was not just Caiaphas's question. It is yours too, and mine. We will come back to it. There is a particular kind of suffering that no one talks about much. It is not the suffering of loss exactly, not the sharp grief of a death or a betrayal. It is quieter than that, and in some ways more corrosive. It is the suffering of a man who has spent decades building something, a reputation, a position, an identity, a careful image of himself as someone who matters, someone who holds things together, someone indispensable, and who begins, slowly, to watch it come apart. Not all at once. That would almost be easier. Piece by piece. Caiaphas did not fall in a single dramatic moment after the resurrection. That is not how these things work. He continued as high priest for several more years. He still wore the robes. He still presided over the temple. He still met with Roman officials and managed the business of the council. From the outside, everything looked more or less the same. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Something that could not be unshifted. The movement he had tried to kill was growing inside the city he was supposed to control. The name he had tried to erase was being spoken in the streets, in the homes, in the very temple courts where he exercised his authority. And the people speaking it were not fringe figures or marginal voices. They were thousands, then tens of thousands. Luke tells us that even a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Even the priests. The institution Caiaphas served was being hollowed out from within, and there was nothing he could do about it that did not make things worse. Every arrest produced more witnesses. Every threat produced more boldness. Every attempt to suppress the message seemed only to scatter it further. The way you cannot put out a fire by scattering its embers. You only spread the burning. He tried once more with real force. Stephen, a man full of grace and wisdom, whose face the council said looked like the face of an angel, was brought before them and stoned to death. It was the first martyrdom, and what followed it was exactly what Caiaphas feared most. Persecution scattered the believers throughout Judea and Samaria, and everywhere they were scattered, they spoke. The message did not shrink under pressure. It expanded. This is one of the deep mysteries of the kingdom of God that no purely political mind can ever fully grasp. The world operates on the logic of force. Apply enough pressure and things break. But the things of God do not follow that logic. They follow a different one entirely. The logic of the grain of wheat that falls into the ground and dies and produces much fruit. The logic of the cross itself, which looked like the end of everything and turned out to be the beginning. Caiaphas had crucified Jesus according to the logic of force. He had applied the ultimate pressure, and it had not broken anything. It had instead cracked something open that was still pouring out 2,000 years later into this very moment, into this conversation, into the quiet place where you are sitting right now, listening to these words. But I want to stay with Caiaphas for a moment longer, not with his failures, with something more human than that. Because somewhere beneath the robes and the politics and the institution, there was a man who had once been young, a man who had perhaps, in some earlier season of his life, felt something genuine when he stood in the temple and the incense rose and the prayers of the people ascended toward heaven. A man who may have entered the priesthood with something real inside him, before the compromises began, before the arrangements with Rome, before the slow drift away from God that power almost always produces in those who hold it too tightly and too long. We do not know what Caiaphas felt privately. The historical record does not give us his interior life. But we know what human beings feel when the structure of their life begins to fail. We know it because most of us have felt some version of it ourselves. That hollow sensation when the thing you trusted most turns out to be insufficient. When the role you played so carefully turns out to have been a kind of costume. When you realize, in the quiet moments you cannot fill with activity or responsibility, that you built on something that is not holding. David knew that feeling. He wrote about it from the inside. The bones that feel crushed, the silence of God that feels like abandonment, the weight of a life that has drifted from its truest center. Elijah knew it. He sat under a broom tree in the wilderness and told God he had had enough. Even Paul, before the road to Damascus, was a man of tremendous institutional certainty who had no idea that his certainty was a prison. God is extraordinarily patient with people who are imprisoned by their own certainty. He does not usually break the door down. He waits. He sends small things first, a question that will not go away, a crack in the wall that lets a little light in, a moment of unexpected stillness in the middle of a busy and important life when something deeper than the busyness speaks. We do not know if God sent any of those things to Caiaphas. We only know what happened to him in the end. And what happened to him was not what he had spent his whole life working to prevent. It was something far simpler and far more final. History has a way of recording the fall of powerful men with very few words. The same chronicles that spend pages describing a man's rise will sometimes dismiss his ending in a single sentence, as if the universe, having watched all the effort and ambition and maneuvering, simply exhales and moves on. That is more or less what happened with Caiaphas. The Jewish historian Josephus, our most detailed secular source for this period, records it plainly. Around 36 AD, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate was recalled to Rome to answer for his conduct in Judea. He had authorized a massacre of Samaritans, and the complaint had finally reached the ears of those above him. Pilate was removed, and almost immediately after Pilate's removal, Caiaphas was also deposed. The two men had been bound together for years. Their arrangement, their mutual usefulness, their shared interest in keeping Jerusalem quiet. When Pilate fell, the architecture of protection that had kept Caiaphas in place fell with him. The new Roman legate, Vitellius, arrived in the region and wasted very little time. He replaced Caiaphas with a new high priest almost as a matter of administrative routine. 18 years, and then, just like that, the robes were handed to someone else. Josephus records the name of the new high priest. He does not spend much time on Caiaphas's departure. There is no dramatic scene, no final speech, no moment of reckoning. Simply a new name in the position, and the implication that the previous occupant had been set aside. After that, Caiaphas disappears from the historical record entirely. We do not know where he went. We do not know how long he lived. We do not know what he did with himself in the years after the robes were taken from him. Whether he returned to his family estate, whether he remained in Jerusalem, whether he watched from a distance as the city he had devoted his life to managing moved toward the catastrophe that was coming. Because catastrophe was coming. Any honest reader of the history of that period can feel it building like a storm on the horizon. The tensions between Rome and Judea that Caiaphas had spent his career carefully managing were not, in the end, manageable. They would explode, in 70 AD, in the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple, the very temple Caiaphas had given everything to protect. The stones would be thrown down, exactly as Jesus had said they would be, every one of them. Caiaphas did not live to see that, most likely, but he lived long enough to lose everything that had mattered to him. The position, the power, the arrangement with Rome, the temple, already slipping from his control even before the robes were taken. The movement he had tried to extinguish, burning now in every direction. And here is the thing I keep coming back to when I sit with this story. The archaeological record gave us something remarkable in 1990. Workers in Jerusalem, conducting construction in a park south of the Old City, accidentally broke through into an ancient burial cave. Inside, they found 12 ossuaries, the limestone bone boxes used for secondary burial in first-century Jewish practice. One of them was ornately decorated, and on it, inscribed in Aramaic, was a name: Joseph bar Caiaphas. Inside the ossuary were the bones of a 60-year-old man. Most scholars believe this is him, the high priest himself, the man who stood across the fire from Jesus on that night before the crucifixion, the man who tore his robes and called it blasphemy, the man who sent him to Pilate. His bones were found in a box in the earth, like everyone else's. There is something in that image that I cannot shake, something that strips away all the grandeur and the institutional power and the carefully constructed importance. In the end, Caiaphas was a man in a box in the ground, the same destination as the fishermen he had threatened, the same destination as Stephen, whom his council had stoned, the same destination as every person who has ever lived on this earth, powerful or powerless, remembered or forgotten, except for one. Except for the one whose tomb was found empty. And I think that is the quiet heart of what this story is really about. Not the politics, not the history, not even the remarkable irony of a powerful man outliving his own power. It is about the only question that any of that history was ever really pointing toward. What do you do with an empty tomb? You can try to explain it away, as the council did when they bribed the guards to say the disciples had stolen the body. You can try to ignore it, as powerful institutions always try to ignore the things that threaten their arrangements. You can go on wearing the robes and managing the affairs and keeping the lid on, for as long as the lid stays on, but the tomb stays empty. And everything, every life, every structure, every carefully constructed identity, has to eventually answer for it. Caiaphas never publicly answered for it, at least not in any record we have, but his silence is its own kind of answer. And you and I, we are not Caiaphas. We are not standing in his place, but we are standing in front of the same empty tomb. And the question it asks does not get easier with time, or with age, or with the weight of everything we have built and managed and tried to hold together. It just gets quieter and more insistent. There is a question that follows a person through the years, the way a shadow follows them through the afternoon. It does not always announce itself clearly. It does not always arrive in the form of a theological crisis or a moment of dramatic doubt. More often it comes in the small hours of an ordinary night, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the strange stillness that descends after a long and busy day, when everything that normally fills the noise has gone quiet, and there is nothing left to distract you from the thing that has been waiting patiently at the edges of your life for a very long time. The question is simply this: is any of this real? Not the world, not the people you love, not the work you have done or the life you have built. Those things are real enough in their own way. The question goes deeper than that. It asks about the foundation beneath all of it, about whether the God you have prayed to, the faith you have carried, the promises you have held on to through the hard seasons, whether any of that connects to something actual, something solid, something that will still be standing when everything else has been stripped away. Most people who have lived past 45 have asked that question at least once in the dark. Some ask it every night and never tell anyone. And the story of Caiaphas, strange as it may seem, has something to say to that question. Not because he found the answer, but because he is the most vivid example in all of Scripture of what it looks like to stand inside the answer and refuse to receive it. Think about what Caiaphas had access to. He was not a man who lacked information about Jesus. He was not someone on the margins who had heard rumors from a distance and could not verify them. He was at the center of everything. He had received the reports from his own officers about what was happening in Galilee. He had almost certainly heard the account of Lazarus. John tells us it was the raising of Lazarus that finally pushed the council to act, which means the council had discussed it, which means Caiaphas had sat in the room where men debated the reality of a dead man walking out of a tomb. He had interrogated Jesus himself, face to face, in the night, by firelight. And when Jesus, under oath before the living God, told him directly, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven," Caiaphas tore his robes. Not because he believed it was blasphemy, because some part of him was afraid it was not. That is the terrible irony that runs underneath the surface of that scene. The tearing of the robes was the prescribed response to blasphemy. It was the right institutional move. It gave the council what it needed to proceed. But it was also the response of a man who needed to shut something down quickly before it had time to take root. Because a man who is completely certain something is false does not need to tear his robes. He simply dismisses it. It is the man who feels the ground shifting beneath him who responds with that kind of urgency. Caiaphas had spent years building a life on the surface of institutional religion, on the forms and the functions and the carefully maintained appearance of proximity to God, while keeping the actual living God at a manageable distance. That is not unique to Caiaphas. That is a temptation that has followed religious people in every century, including this one, including people sitting quietly in their homes tonight, who have said the prayers and attended the services and kept up every appropriate outward form, while somewhere beneath all of it, the deeper encounter has been quietly avoided. Because the deeper encounter cost something. It cost the fishermen everything they had previously organized their lives around. It cost Paul his entire identity. It cost the early believers their safety, their social standing, their place within the structures they had belonged to. What it gave them in return was not a better version of what they had before. It was something of an entirely different order, something that did not depend on position or power or the continued goodwill of Rome, something that could not be taken away by a new governor or an administrative decision or the passage of time, something that death itself had already proven it could not hold. And Caiaphas stood at the very threshold of that something. He was closer to it than almost any other human being who has ever lived. He looked directly into the face of it. He heard it speak. He presided over the trial of it. He watched the soldiers take it away into the night, and he turned back to his institution. He chose the robes over the resurrection. I do not say that to condemn him. I say it because I recognize the choice. Because most of us make smaller versions of that choice with some regularity. We turn back to the manageable thing, the familiar thing, the thing that fits within the life we have already constructed and does not require us to start asking questions we are not sure we want answered. We choose the robes. Sometimes we do it because we are afraid. Sometimes because we are proud. Sometimes simply because we are tired, and the familiar is easier than the true. But here is what the story of Caiaphas makes quietly, unmistakably clear. The robes do not last. Every set of robes that any human being has ever put on has eventually been handed to someone else or laid in the ground alongside the body that once wore them. Every position, every structure, every institution that any person has ever given their life to maintaining has either already fallen or will fall in time. History is littered with the ruins of things that seemed permanent and indispensable to the people who built them. The only thing in the entire narrative of that first-century Jerusalem that did not stay in the ground was Jesus. Everything else, the temple, the council, the high priesthood, the arrangement with Rome, the power of Caiaphas himself, all of it eventually returned to dust. The resurrection did not. And that fact, quiet, stubborn, 2,000 years old and still standing, is still asking its question tonight. Not loudly, not aggressively, just steadily, the way the truth always asks it. What will you do with an empty tomb? There is a man in the Gospel of Luke whose name we are never given. He is hanging on a cross. He is dying. He has, by his own admission, done things worthy of the punishment he is receiving. He has no robes to offer, no position, no institution behind him, no years of religious service to present as credentials, no carefully constructed identity built on proximity to sacred things. He has nothing. And from that nothing, in what may have been the last coherent breath he had left, he turns his head toward the man dying beside him and says something so simple and so devastating in its honesty that it has echoed through every century since. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. Not fix me, not explain this to me, not give me a theological framework for what is happening here. Just remember me. And the answer he received in return was not a committee decision or an institutional review or a carefully worded statement from a council of important men. It was immediate, personal, spoken directly from one dying man to another in the middle of the worst afternoon either of them would ever experience. Today you will be with me in paradise. I have sat with that exchange for many years, and the thing that strikes me most about it, every time I return to it, is the contrast it makes with everything Caiaphas represents. Because Caiaphas had everything the thief did not have: access, authority, lineage, knowledge, position, proximity to the sacred texts and the sacred space and the sacred traditions of his people. He had spent his entire life inside the architecture of religion, and yet it was the man with nothing who received the promise. Not because poverty is inherently holy, not because the thief had earned anything in those last desperate moments, but because of the one thing the thief did that Caiaphas, with all his advantages, could not bring himself to do. He let go. He stopped performing, stopped managing, stopped trying to maintain any version of an image or an arrangement or a position. He had nothing left to protect, and so he simply told the truth about himself and reached toward the only thing that felt real in that moment. And that reaching, that simple, broken, completely unqualified reaching, was enough. It has always been enough. This is the part of the gospel that organized religion sometimes struggles to fully absorb, because it is profoundly inconvenient to institutions. It suggests that the distance between a person and God is not primarily a matter of knowledge or observance or religious credential. It is a matter of honesty, of willingness to stop performing and simply be seen as you actually are. The thief was seen, and he was not turned away. I want to speak directly to you for a moment, if that is all right, because if you have walked with this channel for any length of time, you know that what we do here is not about performance. It is not about having the right answers, or maintaining the right appearance, or keeping up with the forms of faith when the interior has gone quiet. We talk about real things, the doubts that come in the night, the prayers that feel like they are going nowhere, the seasons when God feels very far away, and the promises feel very old, and the faith you carried more easily when you were younger feels heavier now in ways you did not anticipate. We talk about those things because they are the true things, and the only place you can ever meet God honestly is in the true things. If this conversation has been speaking to something real in you tonight, I want to invite you to stay close. Subscribe to this channel and walk with us daily, not because we have everything figured out, but because this is a place where the questions are taken seriously and the faith is not performed, and the God we are reaching toward is the same one the thief reached toward from the cross. Immediate, personal, present, and not in the least put off by the mess of a real human life. Click the subscribe button, walk with us. Bring your real questions. We will bring ours. Because the thief's prayer is still the most honest prayer any of us ever prays, in one form or another. Remember me. And the answer has not changed in 2,000 years. Now, back to Caiaphas, because there is something in his story that we have not yet fully opened, something that sits just beneath the surface of all the history and the politics and the institutional maneuvering, and it has to do with a question that is far more personal than anything we have discussed so far. It has to do with what a man carries when he has done something he cannot undo. Because Caiaphas did something he could not undo. He stood in a courtroom in the middle of the night and handed an innocent man to Rome. He knew the law. He knew what the law said about shedding innocent blood. He had spent his life inside that law. And whatever rationalizations he constructed in the days and weeks that followed, whatever political necessity he told himself justified what he had done, there must have been moments when the rationalization ran thin. Moments when the noise stopped, and the question rose up from somewhere beneath the official version of events. What have I done? Not as an accusation from outside, as a recognition from within. Every person past a certain age carries at least one of those moments. Something done that cannot be undone. Something said that cannot be unsaid. A decision made in fear or pride or self-protection that cost someone else something real, and that no amount of subsequent good behavior has fully neutralized. We carry those things, sometimes for decades, and the question is never really whether we carry them. The question is what we do with them. Caiaphas, as far as we know, carried his in silence. He returned to the institution. He kept the robes on for another several years. He managed the crisis of the growing church with threats and arrests and the occasional act of violence. He did not, in any record available to us, turn toward the one person who could have done anything about what he carried. But the thief did. In the last hour of a ruined life, the thief turned, and found that the door had never been closed. There is something that happens to a person when they have held a burden long enough. It does not announce itself as a crisis. It does not arrive with drama or obvious collapse. It is more subtle than that, and in some ways, more dangerous. It is a kind of slow hardening, a gradual thickening of the walls around the interior life. A process by which the places that were once soft and reachable become, over time, defended and distant, and difficult to access even by the person themselves. Psychologists have a clinical language for it, but the writers of Scripture had a simpler word: hardness of heart. It appears throughout the biblical narrative as one of the most serious conditions a human soul can find itself in. Not because it is unforgivable. Nothing is unforgivable, and the Scripture is consistent on that point from beginning to end. But because it is the condition that makes forgiveness hardest to receive. Not because God withholds it, but because the hardened heart has lost its capacity to feel its own need for it. Pharaoh is the most dramatic example. 10 times God gave him the opportunity to relent. 10 times something in him that had been calcifying for years chose the defended position over the open one. And by the end, the text says something sobering, that his heart was hard, not softened by suffering, hardened by it. Suffering does not automatically produce humility. That is one of the things that surprises people when they first encounter it in their own lives. We assume that difficulty will open us, will make us more honest, will strip away the pretense and bring us back to what matters. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes pain, when it is not properly received, produces in a person a kind of furious tightening, a decision made below the level of conscious thought that the world will not be allowed to get any closer. That vulnerability is too costly. That God, if he was going to allow this, cannot be trusted with the interior life. Caiaphas had lived inside institutional religion long enough to develop a sophisticated version of this hardening. He had learned to handle sacred things at a professional distance. He had learned to speak the language of God without necessarily speaking to God. He had learned, as people in positions of religious authority sometimes do, and as ordinary believers sometimes do as well in quieter ways, to maintain the form while protecting the interior from any genuine encounter that might require something to change. This is not a condition unique to high priests and ancient councils. It is, if we are honest, a temptation that waits for anyone who has been inside the faith long enough to become comfortable with its furniture, long enough to know the right words and the right prayers and the right posture, without necessarily knowing the one those words and prayers and postures are meant to be directed toward. And I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think it is the most personally relevant thing this story has to offer to anyone listening tonight who has been a believer for many years. There is a particular kind of spiritual tiredness that comes not from lack of faith, but from long years of faithful practice that have gradually, almost imperceptibly, become more about maintenance than encounter. You still pray, but the prayer has become a routine rather than a conversation. You still read the scripture, but it has become familiar rather than alive. You still attend, still serve, still show up in all the ways that a faithful person shows up. But somewhere beneath the showing up, something has gone a little quiet, a little distant, and you are not entirely sure when it happened or how to find your way back to the place where it felt real. That is not apostasy. That is not failure. That is a very human experience that has happened to believers in every century, including the ones whose names we now read in the canon of the faithful. Elijah sat under that broom tree not because he had stopped believing in God, but because he was exhausted and depleted, and the fire that had once burned in him had burned very low. David wrote his darkest psalms not as an unbeliever, but as a man who had loved God deeply and found himself in a season where that love felt disconnected from any felt sense of God's presence. The mystics of the Christian tradition had a name for it, the dark night of the soul, and they were careful to distinguish it from simple depression or ordinary discouragement. They understood it as something that could happen specifically to people who had walked with God for a long time, a season of dryness and distance that was not punishment, but invitation. An invitation to go deeper than feeling, to trust beyond experience, to hold on not because you can feel the hand you are holding, but because you know whose hand it is. This is where Caiaphas and the people of genuine faith part ways most clearly. Because the response to spiritual dryness, to the hardening that long exposure to religion without genuine encounter can produce, is not to tighten the grip on the institution. It is not to perform more loudly or manage more efficiently, or surround yourself more completely with the forms and functions of religious life. It is to do the most difficult thing a defended person can do. It is to become quiet, and honest, and small. Not small in a self-punishing way, not the false smallness of excessive guilt or endless self-accusation, but the genuine smallness of a person who has set down the robes for a moment, not because the robes are worthless, but because they have become a barrier, and who stands before God without the title, and without the credential, and without the carefully maintained image, and simply says the truest thing they know. I am here. I am tired. I do not know how to find my way back, but I am still facing in your direction. That is enough to begin with. It has always been enough to begin with. Because the God of this story, the God who met Elijah under the broom tree, not with accusation but with bread, who met Peter on the beach after the betrayal, not with condemnation, but with a charcoal fire and a question asked 3 times with great gentleness, who met the thief on the cross in the last hour of a wasted life with an immediate and unconditional yes. That God is not waiting for you to get yourself together before he moves toward you. He is already moving. He has been moving since before you started listening tonight. The hardness of heart that kept Caiaphas from receiving what was being offered to him was not a permanent condition. It was a choice, renewed daily, to stay defended, to keep the institution between himself and the encounter, to manage God rather than meet him. The opposite of that choice is available to any person at any moment. It was available to Caiaphas on the morning the tomb was found empty. It was available to him every time Peter stood in his council and spoke without fear. It was available to him in the quiet moments between the official duties, when the robes were off and the house was still, and the question that he could not entirely silence was asking itself again in the dark. We do not know if he ever took it, but we know that it was there, and we know that it is here now, in this moment, for anyone who wants it. The door that the thief walked through in his last breath, it has never been closed. I want to tell you about a prayer that almost was not prayed. It is in the Gospel of Mark, in the Garden of Gethsemane, on the night before the crucifixion. Jesus has taken Peter and James and John a little further into the garden and asked them to keep watch. And then he goes on alone, a little further still, and falls to the ground. And he prays. He prays the most honest prayer in all of Scripture. He prays the prayer that every human being who has ever carried something unbearable has prayed in one form or another, even when they did not have words for it. Abba, Father, take this cup from me. 3 words in the original. Abba. The word a small child uses for their father. Not the formal word, not the theological word, the intimate one. The word that assumes closeness. The word that only makes sense if the one speaking it believes, at some level beneath argument and beyond proof, that the one being spoken to is actually there and actually listening and actually cares what happens next. Abba, take this cup from me. And then, in the same breath, the second half of the prayer, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." I have read those words hundreds of times over the course of my life, and I do not think I have ever fully absorbed them, because what they represent is not the suppression of the honest first half. Jesus does not pray the first half and then correct himself, as if the desire to be spared from suffering was somehow beneath him or unworthy of expression. He prays both halves, the full truth of what he is feeling and the full trust in who God is, held together in the same breath, without either one canceling the other out. That is the deepest prayer, not the one that has resolved all its tensions before it arrives at God's door, not the one that has already accepted everything and needs nothing and feels nothing difficult, but the one that brings the full weight of the human moment, the fear, the exhaustion, the desire for a different outcome, and lays it down inside a trust that does not depend on getting the answer it is asking for. Not what I will, but what you will. I want to hold that prayer up beside the story of Caiaphas for a moment, because Caiaphas was, in a sense, on the other side of that prayer. He was the human instrument through which the cup that Jesus was asking to be spared from was being delivered. And what strikes me, sitting with both of these men in the same meditation, is the profound difference in what each of them was holding on to in that hour. Jesus was holding on to his Father. Caiaphas was holding on to his position. And the one who held on to his Father lost everything the world could see and gained everything the world cannot measure, while the one who held on to his position kept it for a few more years and then lost it anyway, and vanished from history with almost nothing recorded about what he thought or felt or became in the end. This is not a comfortable observation. It is not meant to be, because most of us, if we are honest, spend the majority of our lives holding on to something closer to what Caiaphas was holding than to what Jesus surrendered. We hold on to our reputations, our carefully constructed versions of ourselves, our need to be seen as competent and together and spiritually adequate, our arrangements with the world that keep certain uncomfortable truths at a manageable distance. We hold on, and the holding on costs us more than we realize, because what we are holding on so tightly to keep is always going to be handed to someone else eventually, or laid in the ground alongside us. While the thing we are afraid to release, the defended interior, the protected wound, the careful image, is precisely the thing that, if we released it, would open us to the only kind of life that actually lasts. Hannah knew this. She is one of the quietest figures in all of Scripture, and one of the most profound. She went to the temple year after year, carrying a grief so heavy that when she finally broke open before God, the priest watching her thought she was drunk. She was not performing a prayer. She was not maintaining a religious image. She was pouring out her soul, the text says, with such raw honesty that it did not even look like prayer from the outside. And God answered her, not immediately, not with an explanation, but with the thing she had asked for, given in His time and in His way, in a manner she could not have arranged for herself, no matter how carefully she managed her circumstances. The prayer that almost was not prayed, because it was too honest, too exposed, too far from the composed and adequate version of spiritual life we try to present, is very often the prayer that changes everything, because God is not waiting for our composed version. He has seen our composed version. He made us. He knows exactly what is underneath it, and He is not impressed by the performance or put off by the mess beneath it. He is simply waiting for us to stop spending so much energy maintaining the distance between the two. Caiaphas maintained that distance until the end, or at least until the end of what we can see. I hold open the possibility, because the mercy of God is larger than our historical record, that in the years after the robes were taken, in the quietness of a life stripped of its official significance, something shifted, that the questions that had been drowned out by the noise of institutional responsibility finally had enough silence around them to be heard, that an old man in a house in Jerusalem, with no more councils to chair and no more arrangements to manage, finally sat still long enough for the truth to catch up with him. I do not know. The record does not tell us. But I know that the God who went after the one lost sheep while the 99 were safely in the fold is not a God who gives up easily on the ones who have wandered furthest into the defended places of their own construction. I know that the father in Jesus' most famous story did not stop watching the road just because his son had been gone a long time. I know that the distance a person has traveled from the center of their own soul is not an obstacle to God. It is simply the distance He is willing to cross. He has crossed further than that before. He crossed it on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem, when the sky went dark and the earth shook, and the curtain of the temple, the curtain that had separated the Holy of Holies from everything outside it, the curtain that represented the distance between the holiness of God and the mess of human life, tore in two, from top to bottom, not from the bottom up, as a human hand would tear it, from the top down. The distance was not closed by human effort, or human worthiness, or human religious management. It was closed from God's side, in an act so complete and so final that there is nothing left to add to it, and nothing that can be taken from it. The curtain is gone. There is no managed distance left. There is only the choice, available to every person in every moment, to walk through the place where it used to be. Caiaphas spent his life guarding that curtain. And then, on a Friday afternoon, while he was still wearing the robes, it tore. And all his guarding became, in an instant, beside the point. In the end, every life comes down to a very small number of moments. Not the public ones, not the ones that get recorded in histories or remembered by councils or cited in the accounts of important events. Those moments matter in their own way, but they are not the ones that define what a person actually was. At the deepest level, when the performance was over and the robes were off and there was nothing left between them and the truth of themselves. The moments that define a life are the quiet ones. The moment in the dark when a question rises up that has no comfortable answer and you decide, one more time, what to do with it. The moment when something you have been protecting for a very long time becomes more costly to protect than to release. The moment when the defended walls that have kept you safe for decades also reveal themselves to be the thing that has been keeping you from the only life that was ever going to be enough. Those moments do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with trumpets or clear instructions. They arrive the way grace almost always arrives, quietly, without fanfare, easily missed if you are too busy maintaining the arrangements to notice. Caiaphas had those moments. We all do. We do not know what he did with his. The historical record closes around him like water closing over a stone, and he is simply gone. An ossuary in the earth. A name on a limestone box. Bones that were once a man who stood at the most consequential crossroads in human history, and made choices whose reverberations are still being felt 2,000 years later in the hearts of people he never met, in languages he never knew, in a world he could not have imagined. His choices still echo. That is the strange and sobering truth about the decisions we make at the crossroads of our lives. They do not stay contained within our own story. They ripple outward in ways we cannot see and cannot control, and will never fully understand this side of eternity. The choice to harden instead of open. The choice to manage instead of surrender. The choice to guard the curtain instead of walk through the place where it was torn. These choices do not simply affect us. They shape the people around us, the generations that come after us, the small and particular corner of the world that was given to us to tend. And so do the opposite choices. The choice to become honest when everything in you wants to stay defended. The choice to pray the prayer that feels too raw and too exposed to be dignified. The choice to turn, in whatever hour of whatever day you find yourself in, toward the empty tomb and let it mean what it means, rather than spending your remaining energy explaining it away. Those choices echo too, perhaps further, perhaps longer. I think about Peter on the beach after the resurrection, the charcoal fire, the three questions. Do you love me? Each one landing on exactly the wound that needed to be touched. The three denials, met now by three invitations to return. And Peter, who had every reason to stay in the defended place, who had failed publicly and painfully, and in a way that must have felt irreversible, Peter said yes, 3 times, with whatever he had left, which was not much, but which turned out to be exactly enough. Feed my sheep. The broken man was given the broken people to tend, not despite his breaking, because of it, because a shepherd who has never been lost cannot fully find the ones who are. This is the economy of God that makes no sense by any other measure. The ones who have failed most visibly are often the ones most capable of genuine service, because they have been stripped of the illusion that they are doing it from their own sufficiency. They know, in their bones, in the place that cannot be argued with, that whatever they have to offer comes from somewhere outside themselves. Caiaphas never got there, not as far as we know. But you are not Caiaphas. You are here, tonight, at the end of a long story about a powerful man who lost everything he spent his life trying to keep. And the reason this story matters, the reason it has been worth spending this much time inside it, is not so that you can feel the comfortable distance of judging someone who lived 2,000 years ago and made choices you would never make. It is because the choices he made are available to all of us, in smaller and quieter ways, every day. The choice to manage or surrender, to perform or to be honest, to guard the distance or to walk through the torn curtain. And the resurrection that he tried to suppress, the empty tomb that refused to fill back up no matter what the council decided, that resurrection is still standing, still asking its question, still offering its answer to anyone who wants it badly enough to stop protecting themselves from it. The tomb is empty, not as a theological proposition to be debated, not as a historical claim to be verified or dismissed, but as a living fact that changes the nature of every other fact around it, that reorders what matters and what does not, that makes the robes negotiable, and the position negotiable, and the carefully constructed image negotiable, and the defended interior negotiable. Because if the tomb is empty, then the thing you are most afraid of losing has already been defeated, and the thing you are most afraid of being seen as has already been covered, and the distance you have maintained between yourself and God has already been crossed from the other side. You do not have to cross it alone. You never did. That is what this story was always about. Not Caiaphas' failure, not the vindication of Jesus over the institution that tried to erase him, not even the remarkable historical irony of a powerful man outliving his own power by only a few years, while the movement he tried to crush is still here 2,000 years later, still speaking, still reaching, still finding the tired and the defended and the quietly desperate, and saying the same thing it has always said. Come as you are. The curtain is torn, the tomb is empty, and there is a fire on the beach, and bread, and the smell of morning, and a voice that knows your name and is not surprised by anything you have done or failed to do, and is asking you, gently, persistently, with a patience that has outlasted every empire and every institution and every carefully constructed arrangement with the powers of this world. Do you love me? That is the only question that was ever really being asked, and it is still waiting, right now, for your answer. If this journey through the story of Caiaphas touched something real in you tonight, I want to ask you to do something before you close this video. Subscribe to this channel, not as a transaction, but as a decision to keep walking toward the things that matter. We are here every day, going deeper into the stories and the questions and the faith that holds even when everything else is shaking. Share this video with 5 people in your life. Not because the numbers matter, but because you know someone tonight who is guarding a curtain that has already been torn. Someone who needs to hear that the door is still open. Be the one who tells them. Leave a comment below. Tell us what stayed with you. What question rose up in you tonight that you are still sitting with? We read every one. And tell us, what story do you want us to open next? What name, what moment, what corner of the ancient narrative is calling to you? Leave it below, and we will go there together. Until next time, keep your face toward the light.